How we doing, coin traders? Thanks for joining me for the show. We're going to be looking at Internet Computer ICP on that ticker. Been a little bit since we have covered it. Need to talk about this big pullback that we have seen after rejecting from the EMAs. Obviously, the rest of crypto space has been in a little bit of a pullback scenario and a lot of kind of negative things on this Internet Computer chart. Do need to talk about in the show today. So if that all sounds good, you know what to do. Smash that free like button and subscribe if you have not done so just yet. And so, yeah, specifically do want to talk about on this daily, a pretty massive, well, a bunch of different massive lines. Specifically, we're looking at several different trend lines, but then also price lines as well. But obviously, most notably, this trend line for sure is definitely going to be playing into a very big impact on this overall chart setting. And especially now after a big pullback and the failure to see a little bit more follow through is playing out like a little bit more downside or even potentially some shorter term consolidation as we do form inside bars here and probably look to see a little bit more downside unless we can get some sort of black swan catalyst to actually push prices back up and see a lot more of that bullish movement across the rest of the crypto space. But so yeah, obviously extremely relevant trend line, and we can even draw one from the pullback that happened middle of March and actually see a little price action as well. So breaking below this line, and then this one actually extends a little bit farther out, and you can see we do have a little bit more test of this level as we do enter, a little bit farther. And so ever since we have seen a test of this back at the end of December, seen support, and then obviously support. So breaking into that's probably going to be big resistance now up overhead, especially with the exponential moving averages being there as well. Now, if we do want to talk about volume, you can see that we haven't had necessarily that much significant sell-off volume until recently. Have had the last couple of bear selling days be a little bit more on the volume scale than what we typically have seen before. Now, so that does mean a little bit more volume on the bounce days, but still not enough to sustain the movement, especially after a lack of follow through. A lot of that is rubbing off from the rest of the crypto space, but overall, we haven't necessarily seen the best things, especially after holding such a long and strong support level for so long. And one of the things that I actually want to do here is flip over into the 2-day chart now, because this is just an extremely relevant price level for the close that we're actually maintaining, coming in right at just above the 1175 mark. And quite frankly, we can actually draw this a little bit lower for the close to maintain support ever since the end of January. So if we are looking at the levels of support, huge support looking all the way left, resistance and support, and then obviously resistance again before flipping into support, and then support finally before the recent flush here, where now we're seeing downside. So a lot of strong resistance going to be coming in right at that 1065 level. And so right now, trying to find support on top of this pretty big level of previous closing resistance. So looking all the way to the left, looking at this line being that resistance point, and that is going to be coming in, pretty much right at the $10 psychological level, $9.99. So looking all the way left, big points of resistance on this $10 psychological level before finally breaking it, flipping it, finding it as support, as well as support in between this 26 and 50 period EMA, which we also found as support and support for the close. So what we really need to see right now is this level to actually be established as support and to hold. Otherwise, we will be looking downside a little bit further down to some closing levels of support coming in right at 884. So if we do look all the way left again, big period of support. So if we do in fact break $10 psychological, that will be the point that we would actually pull down to. Now, if we do want to pull up some technicals here and actually look at RSI relative strength index, we're currently looking at an RSI of 33.52. So if we actually do see a pullback to that 845 level for ICP, that actually probably would extend this RSI below the 20 line into those oversold levels, or below the 30 line here into those oversold levels. And realistically, we'd probably see a little bit more of a bounce attempt in that instance. So if we do zoom out, we actually haven't had RSI on the 2-day that low since the middle of September. And relating that to the stochastic RSI as well below the 20 line, kind of like what we're seeing right now, could see a very strong case for a lot more bullish upside in that instance, assuming we do actually establish this big level in between 885 and the $10 psychological as a very nice bounce point to see a little bit more upside action and momentum from. Now, do need to talk about Fibonacci retracements from the low here back off of the fall rally all the way up to the all-time high, or excuse me, the trend high right now, just below the $21 mark. Still pulling back to about the 61.8, which is right below that $10 psychological. And that is the point that we kind of did get stuck up at, find it as support. So this is also another very nice line and target, which does fall right in between our $10 psychological and our 884 target. So if we can see a price actually bounce off of 884 and still maintain a close right around this 61.8% retracement and price level for 977, that's where we actually have a very strong opportunity to see that nice bounce. And now realistically, especially since we have been blowing past this big level of sideways trading, unfortunately, that does mean that we are probably going to get stuck a little bit more before actually being able to see any sort of new all-time highs. So once we actually do find longer support and actually bounce, this is going to be the big target and zone that we look to get stuck up at for longer term support. But like we talk about, that's a good sign because when we do retrace, that is that very nice period and opportunity where we can find support before heading back to the upside. So let's actually look at VPVR, volume profile visible range, just to highlight the amount of volume that has been happening in this overall zone. So you can see the lower end, we're actually looking at points of mass right around the 1180 mark, potentially all the way down to about 1150. And then from there, we'd be looking at the upper end of this zone, pretty much right around the $14 psychological. So essentially, we have the big price levels from about 12 to 14, going to be an extremely big resistive zone once we actually do find support. The good news, though, is that we still haven't found a complete lack of support on the VPVR. So that does go down to about 950. But if we do slack off and actually go down to about 850 or so, we're pretty much going to lose VPVR support. And then we would be looking to prices heading down into about the $7 level and realistically finding support after that down into the mid to low sixes. Definitely not calling for that as a scenario. And then even looking at a Fibonacci, if that were the case though, and just to kind of highlight how that's not necessarily a scenario, that would actually put the prices down about the 78.6 retracement at 6.765. So not an impossible scenario, but not necessarily the most likely right now, and especially not most likely anytime soon. So I don't see a flush down, especially with a lot of this previous trading price level support, as well as VPVR support. I would expect a little bit more sideways consolidation, at least for a minimum of a week or two, before any substantial pullback does push prices down to that level. But like we said, that's actually not the most common scenario right now. We are still looking up at finding supports. Probably going to be down into that upper $8 level here, but realistically finding something in that zone between now and about 850. So good news from that point though is that if we actually do look at about 850 until the current or most recent trend high, we're looking at about just shy of 150% gain at 145, so 2.45x return if you do make an entry right at that 850 mark. So plenty of upside potential to get back to the most recent trend high here. And so even from that trend high down to current prices anyway, about a 51% retracement, which isn't necessarily the worst that we have seen out of crypto and altcoins right now. But obviously still nonetheless, a 50% retracement is still significant nonetheless. And now do need to flip over into the weekly chart. We have talked about how ICP had one of the better looking longer term weekly charts here. And essentially that has changed a little bit more, especially after seeing the most recent 4 weeks of downside, and especially starting to now, despite having almost 4 days left on the current candle, still looking like there's potential to actually see a close below this 50-period EMA, which we actually haven't seen since we have had our bullish break and reversal here coming off of the fall rally and topping out on the candle that happened on the 25th of March here. So now we can see a lot of upside wicks, and these wicks do signal a lot of downside selling pressure, especially since lower downside shadows are minimized and we do have significant bearish pressure to the downside. Now, if we actually zoom out, we can see that we're not actually necessarily looking at that much strong bearish volume. In fact, it's kind of quite the opposite. We've actually seen a huge decrease in taper off in all selling pressure here, especially after putting in our trend high. So selling pressure is starting to get exhausted despite what the rest of the markets are doing. I don't necessarily anticipate them to start picking back up here as we do push prices forward. And that's another reason that we're looking at 850 kind of being one of the lower ends of the target, is that we are looking at selling pressure just getting exhausted in this instance. So we could be looking at a potential for a very nice and significant bounce. And like we said, with still almost 4 days left on the current weekly candle, Still potential to see the bulls buy that dip and actually see a weekly close on top of this 50-period EMA. Right now, we're looking at a 50-period EMA coming in at 10,498. So we would need to see the bulls actually sit at close on top of about 1050 in order to see the weekly candle close on top of that big 50-period EMA support point. But then overhead, like we mentioned, plenty of stronger upside resistance coming in all the way at the $11 level. And then all the way from there, we're going to have resistance up to about 1168. So even despite holding it, we're still going to have a very big struggle, and that's why it will rely on a lot of volume. And we haven't necessarily seen a nice increase in bullish volume either. And so especially after putting in the trend high, not much buying pressure coming in, so a little bit more sideways and pullback pressure. But like we said, starting to get exhausted, but nonetheless still highlights just the importance and impact of needing to see a lot of volume to actually break through this big support zone or resistance zone that will now be resistance, and we need to flip it into support. And like we said, pretty much from the $11 to $12 level, but specifically 1108 to 1168. So about a 60%, or excuse me, a 60-cent zone, and a lot of opportunity here if we can actually get back above that to see a continuation back to the upside. But the longer it does take the bulls to get back on top of that big resistance point, the more likely it will be that we will be heading down to that 850 support point. And hopefully that does hold as well before sending us down into the low $7s and $6 range. Looking at some technicals now for the weekly RSI, well below the moving average line, which does signal path of least resistance here to the downside. So we're relying on that a little bit more. Typically, we see a return to about the 50 line or even potentially down to the 40 before we actually start seeing potential for a little bit of return. So if we do go ahead and look left, we can see that's a very significant level because we have seen the 40 line be resistance for the RSI as well as support for the RSI, especially as it does apply to this overall exponential moving average for the relative strength index here. So ideally, we would love to see RSI hold in this overall 50 to 40 zone and then probably see a little bit more upside pressure, especially since we're looking at stochastic RSIs being well below the 20 line, smashed almost against the bottom at 0.21 and 1.82. So plenty of opportunity to see a bullish cross and see that momentum pushed back to the upside. Like we talked about last time, we actually saw the stochastic RSI this low below the 20 line. We actually did see a bullish cross eventually, and that did lead to a very nice upside move where we did get very nice RSI overbought indications. And then obviously RSI, stochastic RSI, did go back over that 80 line and see a very nice bullish formation here before crossing back over the downside. So still not much of a pullback overall relative to what we have seen and needed to pull back. So still plenty of potential to push prices back to the upside here, ultimately for a new trend high. It's just right now we're not looking at that coming in anytime here soon. But in the near-term future, we are going to be looking at those short-term price supports to see if they do hold. And then that will be our guide to let us know whether or not we're expecting a little bit more price bump back to the upside here. So unfortunately, not better news, and especially after sitting sideways pretty much for about 5.5 to 6 months, we're looking at now a little bit more pressure to the downside. So obviously frustrating just having prices sit sideways for that long and that period of a time. But overall, still know that we have a lot of potential to the upside, just like we saw when we did set our current trend high. So nothing to think we couldn't actually do that again. And especially since we do have a lot more bullish sentiment coming here for the upcoming months here for the altcoin space, because we haven't seen anywhere close to a return to bullish sentiment overall and that hype and euphoria for most retail investing scenarios. So as we do wait for that, just be patient, and overall, nothing is financial advice on this channel, obviously, but this is a perfect opportunity to be buying those dips as we do look at those support levels and dollar cost average if you have missed a little bit more of those lower low prices. But yeah, otherwise, that is going to go ahead and wrap up the show today on Internet Computer ICP on that ticker. Hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please hit the thumbs up, like, and subscribe if you have not done so just yet. Also, drop me a note in the comments section if you haven't done so just yet, too. Do love getting back to each and every one of you. Or feel free to reach out over on Twitter or X at coin_trades is the handle over there. So that is going to do it for now. Do appreciate all the continued love and support. As always, it does mean so much. Stay safe, coin traders. Take care, and I'll catch you back in the next video.